Welcome everybody to the first session of Forward Nanaimo 22. I'm Heather Bates. I'm one of the people organizing this conference. I've been living in Nanaimo for about 2.5 years now, and I am currently serving as the chair of the Nanaimo Climate Action Hub. So myself and other organizers are really hoping that this workshop series is going to help build some foundational knowledge on local issues that are really important in the Nanaimo region and central Vancouver Island, and to become a driver of some good action amongst candidates for the upcoming 2022 local government elections. I want to acknowledge that the regional district of Nanaimo is situated on the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw, the Snuneymuxw, the Staminas, the Qualicum, the Hupacheseth, and the Comox First Nations. We recognize that the historical and ongoing injustices perpetrated by the colonial system against the Indigenous peoples who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. And we understand that living and working on these lands means that we also have a responsibility to not only strive for meaningful nation-to-nation relationships between our colonial governments and the First Nations, but also to care for and protect the land, the water, and the air that we all rely on. So our format for this evening's webinar will be to have 3 8-minute presentations by each of our panelists, and that'll be followed by a short 5-minute question and answer time before we move into 3 different breakout rooms for discussion. And we're going to end then with the last 15 minutes being back in the large group where we can share the outcome of the discussions and talk a little bit about what's going to come next. So as we go through the presentations, please do feel free to put any questions and comments that you might have into the chat as we go along. And then once we get to the Q&A time, we'll take some questions from the chat and have our panelists discuss and give a few answers in the time that we have allowing. We are recording this evening's session, and we're going to make this available to the public so that we can share the ideas with a broader audience. And we might also wish to use some of the input that people provide in the breakout groups or comments in the chat for other communications. For example, during the election campaigning period, we might want to take some of the good questions or comments that people suggest tonight and really put those to anyone who might be running for office, that sort of thing. But we're not going to, attribute anything to a particular person by name unless we have your express permission to do that. So feel free to speak accordingly. And anyone who doesn't really want to be recorded, you're welcome to just keep your camera off and keep yourself muted if that's your preference. So without further ado, I will introduce our first panelist, Paul Manley. Paul has been an environmental and social justice activist since he was a teenager. In 2019, Paul was elected as the 2nd Green Member of Parliament in Canada, and he served as the MP for Nanaimo Ladysmith until 2021. Paul is currently the executive director of the Nanaimo Unitarian Shelter, and he's a program and projects coordinator for Growing Opportunities Farm Community Cooperative. So please go ahead, Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. Thank you for putting this on. I would like to also acknowledge that I am here on a traditional unceded territory of the Nanaimo First Nation. I've been interested in this issue of agriculture and climate change and the environment for a long time. People ask, how do these things connect? And how did we get to the situation that we're in? And we've seen an industrial revolution in agriculture with mechanized farming, the creation of monocrops, creating higher yields through inputs like fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and the concentration of feedlots for animal agriculture. And we've seen a trend, 4 decades of trade liberalization, the free trade era, where agriculture has moved from local to an industrial and globalized model. And, using something called comparative advantage, where corporations are going to where they can get lower wages and lower environmental standards to grow things cheaper for consumers in wealthy parts of the world. And so we've seen the loss of family farms and community farms, not just here in North America, but all over the world. And this has heavily affected local food production in low-income countries, and it's created uprisings like the Zapatista uprising in Mexico, with the loss of their traditional corn crops and the industrialization of agriculture there. And it's resulted in cheap food in North America, which we have completely taken for granted now, the cost of food. But climate change is disrupting that globalized model. So we're seeing droughts, weather is less predictable. Industrial agriculture has drained aquifers that are not being replenished. And this is especially true where we get a lot of our food from in California. Exporting food equals exporting water. And so we are moving water around the world and creating droughts and desertification in places that have been breadbaskets in the past. And we know that, Mesopotamia used to be a major grain growing area, and it's a desert now. The Horn of Africa used to be the land of plenty, and it's dealt with droughts based on human activity and disruption to natural systems. So supply chains are disrupted due to weather events, COVID, war. We've seen supply chain disruptions with the floods in the Fraser Valley, with the fires. And Vancouver Island is particularly vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. In emergencies like with earthquakes, we're reliant on the ferries. We're reliant on stuff being shipped over here, and highway closures have seen supply chain disruptions in the Lower Mainland and on Vancouver Island. Vancouver Island used to produce about 75% of the food that it consumed, and we exported food, and now it's less than 5%, and the number one crop on Vancouver Island is hay. And this whole process that we're seeing right now, we're seeing inflation in the food system because of supply chains, and the most vulnerable populations are the ones that are most affected by fluctuations and rising prices. And so this is really affecting people who are living on low incomes and fixed incomes, like seniors, single parent families, people with diverse abilities, and people who are marginalized in our society traditionally, based on historic injustices with Indigenous people, with new immigration, people who have come here as refugees in particular, rather than immigrants who come here with money. And those are the people that are most affected by these huge price fluctuations. Water is being commodified around the planet, and aquifers and water is being bought up. So watersheds are being bought up, and in some places water water licenses control the rain. And we have one situation like that in British Columbia with Alcan, which owns the water rights to a whole valley and owns all the water that falls from rainfall because of that. And this is a trend that has happened all through the Southwest United States, and it's happened in places in other parts of the world where water is commodified. And so there's a real need to protect our local watersheds, which are privately owned. They're all on private forest lands, and they could be sold. Right now, they're owned by companies that are owned by pension funds, but they could be sold to international corporations. And we need to do a better job of protecting our watersheds through natural forest function. Water retention through natural forests and filtration of water saves us money in filtration plants. It saves us money in terms of making sure that we retain water. And Victoria, the Capital Regional District, is a great example of how we should be looking at water in this particular region. And I know Arzina is going to get into water use in terms of water use on agricultural land, but we also need to make sure that we need changes in our water use licensing here in our municipalities, so that people that are growing food can access water cheaper, as long as they are doing it in a way that is conserving water and not wasting water. So we need to move to a more localized food system. And there's been different attempts at rebuilding the food system here in different ways. We're seeing a lot more farmers markets to protect, to support local farmers. There was a move to create a farmers cooperative, the Heritage Food Service Cooperative, where a lot of farmers were going to work together to produce crops and to be able to sell into larger markets, because what we have is a lot of small farms on Vancouver Island rather than a lot of large production farms. And in many ways, that's how we're going to need to move forward, is to support local agriculture so that we support local farms and smaller farming operations. So like I was saying, monoculture crops, corn, soy, etc., is feedstock for animal feedlots, is destroying the soil. Industrial animal agricultural is extremely detrimental to the environment, and it's a climate change accelerator. There's about 70 billion animals that are slaughtered every year. About 65 billion of them are chickens. Next is almost 2 billion pigs, and then that's followed by goats and cows. And we have food miles that add a carbon footprint to our food. So we need to look at changing our diets to more plant-based local foods. And animals still have a place in regenerative agriculture, but there needs to be more balance in the system. So 70 billion animals a year being slaughtered for food is not sustainable. And anybody that's interested in how animal agriculture could fit into a model of sustainable plant-based agriculture, I would recommend the film Kiss the Ground. And at the Klein Farm, we do have regenerative agriculture happening with Ben Glasson. Glasson Farms is working on rotating animals through the 47 acres there, and Growing Opportunities is growing local vegetable production there that is helping to feed low-income individuals and families and provide labor for people with barriers and challenges. So we're working on building community resilience, combating climate change, and helping to make sure that people in need are taken care of. In terms of what municipalities can do, Ladysmith has really done a great job of using its traditional decorative garden space at City Hall and boulevards and in parks to grow more food. And I know that Nanaimo is moving that way. We need more food forests. We need more use of our park spaces to grow food. And municipalities really need, and regional districts really need the help of government. So I just did a quick search on urban agriculture grants from the federal government, and I found there's lots of money down in the United States, but all of our agricultural programs in Canada through the federal government are primarily targeted at export markets and at that, monoculture commodities, canola, corn, soy, and then feeding animals for export. And we need to move away from that and look more at taking care to ensure that we build local resilience and support local food everywhere in Canada, because you can grow garlic in the Yukon. You can grow garlic anywhere in Canada pretty much. There's no need to be importing it from China or from anywhere else. And that's key to addressing climate change and why agriculture is so important. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you.
I know that Arzina is going to really touch on a lot of the local stuff. Thanks,
Thank you so much, Paul. It's great to have that kind of broad overview there, looking at the global perspective and how it comes down to local community action. So thank you so much for your wisdom. And next up, we are going to hear from Arzina Hamir. Arzina is a farmer in the Comox Valley, and she serves as the Area B Director for the Comox Valley Regional District. Please go ahead, Arzina.
Thanks so much. I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully that works, or maybe not. Hold on a second. Apologies. I'll try it again. Thanks, and thanks to Paul for setting this up, because there's actually a few slides that overlap, and I promise we didn't plan this. So as was mentioned, my name is Arzina Hamir. I'm a farmer in the Comox Valley, about an hour and a bit north of Nanaimo. My family and I moved here about 10 years ago. Prior to that, I was farming in Richmond in the Lower Mainland, doing a lot of urban agriculture. So some of the points that I'm going to talk about today really pull on that experience of farming in an urban environment. And then some of my points are going to talk about my experience here on the island and in Comox Valley. So, as Paul mentioned, on Vancouver Island, we are particularly vulnerable to issues around food security, because we are growing 4% of the food that we consume. And we've seen with COVID what a difference this is making, to our food prices when we have to absorb the shocks that are coming outside of our control, and B, just not even finding certain crops on the shelves. Certain food things that we are relying on imports sometimes don't even make it to our shelves anymore. For those reasons alone, I think many people are understanding that we need to strengthen our food system. It's extremely efficient, but it's also extremely fragile. And when we have shocks like what we're seeing with COVID and now with the war in Ukraine, there are some very big reverberations that are happening to our food system. So Paul mentioned garlic, and I also wanted to talk about garlic, because it's one of the crops that I think, it really represents so much. That's both good and bad in our food system. So I don't have a stat, but I would say 95% of the garlic that is sold in supermarkets and in the big box stores is imported either from California or from China. So, it really is, it embodies those food miles that Paul was talking about. Even though it's a crop that could grow and does grow so well here in BC. I love growing garlic. We grow about 12,000 bulbs on our farm, which sounds like a lot, but literally takes up a quarter acre. You can grow a lot of garlic in a very small space. It is primarily a winter production crop. It's planted in the late fall and then harvested in the following summer. And for that reason, we also don't irrigate garlic. So it doesn't require a lot of inputs water-wise. It is a nutrient requiring crop. So we do need a lot of fertility to grow garlic. But it's one of those crops that I think on Vancouver Island, we should absolutely be self-sufficient, and we should not be importing anything from California or from China. And garlic preserves really well in many different ways. So even if we can't have fresh garlic between the months of like March to June, when it's a little bit tough to find fresh garlic, there are other ways that we could be eating it. And it just requires a small change in the way that we use and work with garlic. But it certainly epitomizes the possibilities of what could happen here on the island. To be self-sufficient in certain key crops, I think, I hope that just sparks something in people's minds that I know this was like my gateway crop into farming. I didn't want to be buying any more garlic. And, we use about 2 bulbs a week of garlic. So I was on an urban lot in Richmond, decided to grow a couple of hundred bulbs of garlic. And that was it. That was the gateway into me starting to farm. Now I produce food on a much larger area. It's been absolutely fantastic growing food for my community. We are a certified organic farm, and we have about, I believe the count now is 47 or 48 different crops that we grow from spring to all the way into November, December. One of the newest crops that we're trying is ginger. And we're primarily looking at ginger and other heat-loving crops to withstand future heat domes that we are predicted to be having. It's getting harder and harder to be producing tomatoes and cucumbers in greenhouses when those greenhouse temperatures hit 50 degrees. But there are crops that do like that temperature. Similarly, as Paul mentioned, we could have this type of abundance up and down Vancouver Island. We certainly have the climate to be growing an abundance of food. And much of that hay crop that Paul mentioned, that land could certainly be converted into food production. And that's what we did on our farm 10 years ago. It was primarily a hay production crop. And with some investment in irrigation and fencing, we're now we have about 6 acres in production. What does it take, though, to increase the amount of food being grown on Vancouver Island and in Nanaimo particularly? Well, we do have land. Getting that land in the hands of people who are willing and able to grow on it is one of the key issues, I would say. Training young people and attracting them into farming and food production is another. For the longest time, our higher levels of education really missed opportunities to train young people in farming. I'm noting that there are many more opportunities now than even 10 years ago, with different programs doing on-farm training for young people to get skills in food production. I should mention I have my undergrad in agriculture, and after 4 years of studying agriculture, I was given a packet of tomato seeds, and I literally had no idea what I was supposed to do with it. Formal training, higher levels of agriculture education are not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about skills, hands-on skills that people can use, and not necessarily even go into commercial production, but even for their own personal food security. This is something that we've kind of let lapse for a very long period of time. And now with the emergence of farm to school at both the elementary and high school level, I'm seeing more and more young people interested in getting their hands dirty and growing some more food. The other thing that Paul mentioned, and what I'm going to end on, is the need for water. Without water, there is no agriculture, there's no farming. It is such an incredibly important aspect of food production that I think I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on it. Paul mentioned that as with climate change, we are starting to see more and more weeks of drought in our summer months. And the stress that this is putting on both our aquifers and our rivers, due to farmers and individuals also pumping out of aquifers, but farmers mostly who have licenses in rivers, is causing stress situations on our fish habitat. And I really, there is a very simple answer, I think, to that, and that is on-farm water storage. So this is a photo of a dugout. A dugout is just simply a pond that isn't refreshed through an aquifer or through any kind of underground spring. It primarily stores runoff from overland rainfall and holds that water until the farmer needs it during the summer months. In 2015, if those of you who were around here on the island, if you remember, we had another summer. We had a summer that year of, I counted at our farm, 11 weeks of no rain. And we lost on our farm our entire onion crop, and a number of other crops were highly stressed. And I pledged that year, and my husband and I, just said, we can't go through that again. We invested in a dugout that is 30 meters by 40 meters, 30 feet by 40 feet by 18 feet deep. So it actually is not a huge footprint on the farm because we were able to go very deep into the ground, but it holds over 400,000 gallons of water. Now, something like that, if you can't imagine what that quantity of water looks like, it was 110 dump truckloads of soil that came out of that hole. But what that hole has been able to do for us is we are able to grow far more food, and we're much more self-sufficient on our water. We don't, tap into the aquifer, and we certainly don't tap into streams. And investments like this do cost, some money. So this is where different levels of government can come in to support the type of food and farming system that we want by investing in this type of infrastructure. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand it back to Heather, and hopefully we can dig into some of these concepts and ideas in the breakout rooms. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Arzina. And it's wonderful to have someone like yourself who's an experienced farmer who really knows what's needed on the ground level with this. So really appreciate you speaking tonight and joining us. And our third and final panelist of the evening is Jen Cody. Jen has been active in the food community since 1998. She's a registered dietitian and she's a founding member of the BC Food Systems Network. She is a former director of food and nutrition security for Nanaimo Food Share, a nonprofit that supports programs and community development related to food security and sustainable local food systems. Jen, I will pass it over to you.
Hello, everybody. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm phoning in from Sishad and Hupachasset territory this evening, and I'm really pleased to be here. And yeah, I'm also a part of the Growing Opportunities Co-op, and happy to be farming and active in growing food in the Nanaimo territory. So thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here tonight. And thanks, Heather, for all of your organizing as well. I'm going to try to do two things at once here, which is share my screen and look at some notes. And who knows if I'm going to be particularly successful at being able to do that, but I'll give it a try. I just have to figure out where my screen is. Just a minute. Let's see. Alrighty, here we go. Okay. Okay, so so this is a picture that is of Growing Opportunities, one of the places where we're growing at the moment. And I just need to see if I can get into my other screen. I guess not. Okay, I don't think I can do two things at once. Sorry, everybody. So anyway, so for one of the things I wanted to talk to you a little bit is just talking a little bit about the perspective from Growing Opportunities. And I was really pleased that Paul was talking a lot about the global perspective and Arzina, the growing perspective, and also some of the local perspective of the work that you've done. And the work that Growing Opportunities has really done has been focusing more on the local and the social perspective. And so I was really pleased when you started talking a little bit, Arzina, about the critical piece that needs to happen in supporting a local food system is having people who are interested and wanting to grow that food. And so that training and having opportunities is one of those critical pieces. And so is the land, a really critical piece of being able to grow the food. And so you know, and in the work that Growing Opportunities has done and the work that Food Share has done has been really partnering with local nonprofits and with the city and all the stakeholders that are part of the food system in our community to look for ways of just being able to relocalize the food system and bring more of those opportunities forward. And the two main factors that really support that are having the land access, having the water access, and having the people who are willing to do the work. to actually grow the food and to train people and share those skills in the community to allow that to happen. And so, the reasons that we've gotten into that is because we really see that there's opportunities for agriculture and food to really support so many of the important aspects of the municipality and what it does in creating a healthy and dynamic city for its citizens. And the donut economics aspect of and direction that the city is going is a really good example of a really progressive way of moving that piece forward. And we sort of see the food piece as being one of the areas that's essential for being able to move all of those elements of donut economics forward for the city overall. The food security piece, we know, and with more local food and farms that then are producing that food, do things like increase biodiversity. So Arzina, I know that one time you've chatted a while back about having increased biodiversity on the edges of agricultural land, and that's certainly something that we've seen at Growing Opportunities, where the edges and the bushes and all the things that are a part of regenerative land use has increased the ability of that land to support a very diverse group of organisms, right through all the pollinators and through to all the other critters that end up living in that area too. We know that one of the areas that's been important for land is in the environmental stewardship of that land. And so not only the biodiversity piece, but also as flood protection and water management, because that land then is able to absorb the water and the rains when it comes and then release that water slowly over time. And so in the dry season, there's more of a shoulder where there's more water available because of farmlands actually being able to hold that water. Whereas if you have housing and concrete, then that water just runs straight off and into the sewer system. You don't have that ability to retain that water at that point. And of course, agricultural lands increase food production and increases access to food for people in the community. And with Growing Opportunities as a social enterprise and an organization that's growing with support through government funding, then we're able to hire people with diverse abilities and then produce that food and then offer that food through means like the Good Food Box in partnership with Nanaimo Food Share. That then allow that increased access to those healthy foods that has been so important as a part of being able to support more of a local food supply. And also increase local food infrastructure and supply increases the resilience of the community in times of emergency. So one of the areas that we know that we're planning for is a time when there's an earthquake, or if we have a tsunami in our area, or other types of climate emergencies that we know are starting to become more prevalent. And when those food chains become disrupted, then the more food that we're able to produce on a local level gives our communities more resiliency to be able to weather some of those storms. And an important part of being able to do that is by partnering and doing education in terms of community involvement in agriculture through things like community farms, and then addressing that piece of educating people to have opportunities to really become involved in agriculture, from school kids all the way on up to elders and everybody in between, and engagement so that people can take some of those skills and then farm or garden on their own properties, or to collectively work together on a larger farm scale and produce food for the community overall. And the city makes decisions about how they can support those types of activities happening in our city. And we're really fortunate in Nanaimo because Nanaimo has made a priority of those types of activities. They were the body that purchased the 5-acre farm, have made a priority of making sure that that property is being used agriculturally. They're creating a park plan that includes agriculture as a part of that. And Nanaimo also is looking at uses for the East Wellington Park, which is also in the ALR. And so they're able to have opportunities to maintain agriculture happening within the city boundaries. And the more that Nanaimo is actually able to continue to do that, I think that the healthier that our community is going to be. Because right now, Nanaimo is in a transition where more and more housing is becoming, is being built within the city. Fewer and fewer properties are still available to be able to produce, to potentially produce food. And where the city can really have an impact is in zoning and bylaws that influence what activities are allowable on those lands. And so with zoning, municipalities can have impact on the availability and allowed uses of land. And so in thinking about, the discussion that we're having this evening, then that's really one of the major pieces that I think is something that we could look for in the new municipal election, is individuals who really carry that value around food, who want to see progressive steps forward in being able to support food. And one of those areas is making a priority for food and agriculture throughout all of the departments within the city. So the city can use zoning as a regulatory tool for to control what's allowed uses of land. They can separate land use, but they really one of the areas that is of a great potential is for zoning codes to reduce restrictions on agricultural uses, provide guidance on the proper use, and the potential that can then potentially increase residents' access to healthy food in an area by being specific about what are the allowed uses for different zones that include agricultural uses being a part of that, and allowing mixed use of land as well. So for example, mixed land use zoning that supports food sustainability so that allowable land uses includes things like education and housing and agriculture all on the same property is a way to also increase the potential land uses and food production that occurs within the city limits, but also in the regional district as well. Place agriculture on the best agricultural land. And so zoning land that is agricultural as being agricultural is something the municipality could do, and include high density housing on the edges of that agricultural land to allow residents to have opportunity to be next to and engage in agriculture, and to allow that land to produce food for individuals, but also to allow that use to be food production on a commercial level. And leave land that's not suitable for agriculture for other land uses, residential, for businesses, for industrial uses. The city could recognize the importance of food issues by ensuring that there's a food mandate integrated in throughout all the city departments, and hire a food security manager as a part of the city staff that then can help support those departments in being able to move the food pieces forward and integrate that piece around the implementation of policy that's being created by the city in the new Reimagine Nanaimo piece, and create opportunities for creating measurable impacts around food. So at the city having policy that, as an example, where meetings and events have a minimum % of that food being provided through local means is an example of something like that. But really the most important things that a city can do is through their policy and through zoning, support agriculture and making the food and agriculture piece a real priority. And I think,
Thank you. Yes,
that's it.
Yeah, we got so much packed into such very brief presentations. So appreciate, everybody's ability to really get all that important stuff in there in such a short time. Really great to have some of those ideas on what the role is for government and where we need the policies to make all these changes possible. So we're at the question and answer period, which is just going to be a brief little 5-minute time. We've had a couple of questions through the chat, so maybe we'll do 1 or 2 of those and see if we've got time for anything more after that. So a good one here from Trent is asking, what policies can the city, regional district, and province create to increase runoff retention on farms and private forests through mulching, swales, weirs on ephemeral streams, dugouts, etc., as appropriate to each parcel and coordinated with neighbors? So anybody, any of the panelists want to take a stab at that one?
I can try. I'm not sure if a policy is really maybe the tool that is needed there. What we do have in BC is called the Environmental Farm Plan, and it enables farms to access funding to install exactly what you're talking about, ways of retaining not just water, but also, you know, runoff, manure runoff on farm, so that it's not contaminating, you know, streams and nearby neighbors. So that does exist. And I don't think, yeah, farmers don't necessarily respond well to policy. So having incentives is, I think, probably one of the better methods to go forward.
Yeah, and the only other part I'd add to that is I also know that with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that there are individuals there who are specialists in terms of like stream health and have that understanding. And I know that through some of their support, they've been really good at being able to work with farmers to help that cross understanding around what the needs of the farmers are and what the needs of a healthy stream might be, and creating opportunities for win-wins in terms of how the farmers are stewarding that land, but also stewarding the streams that are a part of the land that they're producing food on.
Thank you. So next question I'll go to is from Francis, who commented that Toronto has something like 70 green roofs, and they're producing a lot of local food on top of their skyscrapers to absorb and retain rainwater. So she's wondering if there might be a role for that in Nanaimo.
I would just say that there's actually in France, they have rules and regulations around green roofs. Like they've mandated green roofs. They've also mandated food recovery processes to ensure that food isn't wasted. So they, in other jurisdictions around the world, they've done these kind of things, and I think that that's something that definitely could be done here. We don't necessarily want more skyscrapers in Nanaimo, but you know, buildings can be productive places in terms of carbon sequestration and growing food, and you know, that's policy that could be included in building codes. You know, something that we could press the provincial governments to take on in terms of building code.
Thanks, Paul. And I see Ben's got a good question in the chat here about what's been done in the Comox Valley around food security, and Arzina's on top of that in the chat. So maybe you can follow some of her responses in there. And maybe we'll go to a question from Zenny mentioning zoning. Let's see. Yeah, she says, when you mention zoning and reducing restrictions on agriculture, can you expand on this? So I don't know, Zenny, if you had, what was one of the panelists in particular that you were
it was
wondering?
It was when Jen was speaking, and she was saying one of the things municipalities can do, and I was really listening to the land use and how we're trying to support agriculture, but a lot of the land we don't own and we don't necessarily control. So when it perked my interest when you said we could reduce restrictions, and I was like, all I can think of is we allowed chickens a few years ago. So is it about how much we're allowed to grow in our backyards, or what could we do?
Yeah, and I think some of it is also property taxes. So I know that, you know, if you have a parcel that is that's 5 acres in total, then you can, if you demonstrate a certain amount that's being sold from that property, that you're then able to get a property tax reduction. But you have to have that 5 acres. And I think that, you know, as an example, then if you had a lower acreage amount and had a similar amount that's matches what the lower acreage amount is, but demonstrates that there's food production happening in an intentional kind of way to grow for the community, then providing those type of tax breaks might be helpful. I think too that,
that would probably be controlled by the province because it would be property tax, right? But it's something we could advocate for. So.
Yeah, and I think too, then being specific within zoning regulations too, sort of saying that like within a residential zone blur, like, whatever that happens to be, agricultural uses are allowed. And then that way people, when they're purchasing that property and have that understanding, then they know that they're moving into something that has that potential. If it isn't specifically mentioned within that zoning type, then it's less likely that people will assume that it's not an allowable use of that land. And so by saying that it is an allowable use and being specific about that, then I think you open up more of those possibilities, just as an example.
Good point. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just keeping a mindful eye on the time here. I see there's a couple of people with their hands up, Ben and Dawn. If you would care to maybe just put your questions in the chat, then we maybe will see whether we can get to them or maybe respond with follow-up after the meeting if we're not able to get to it tonight. But I do think it's important that we move into our discussion groups, as we want to make sure we have enough time for some good discussion to happen there. So we'll have about 25 minutes in these breakout rooms. There'll be about 10 people in each room. So I'll just ask that everybody kind of try to be mindful of, understanding that means everybody should have about 2.5 minutes to speak if they so wish. Try to kind of allow time for everyone to have some input. We're going to sort the breakout rooms so that one of our 3 panelists will be in each of the rooms, as well as one of the folks who are on the organizing committee of this event, to hopefully cover the bases. And we're going to ask that we focus on 2 particular questions to be discussed and for everyone to respond to in this. The first question is, how has food security impacted you personally in the last few years? And the second question is, in the context of the municipal elections, what should candidates know or do? So I'm going to provide a bit of technology as a way of taking notes in these breakout groups. It's a Google Jamboard, and I will just demonstrate how to use that. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to get you there. So I'm just first going to drop this link into the chat that everyone is welcome to go to, that will take you to our spot where we're going to take notes as a group during this meeting. And then now I'm going to share my screen and just quickly show you how to use it. Okay. So this is the Google Jamboard. It's got 3 pages. This first one here says notes from Paul's breakout room. I've just labeled the breakout rooms according to the first name of each of the panelists that are in that room, so you'll know which one to use. So if you're in the breakout room with Paul, then you're in the right place. And when you want to put a note on here, you just go over to this left menu where there's a little sticky note picture. You click that, and then you can type in my comments, whatever your comments are. You can change the color of the sticky note if you want with these buttons. You press save, and your sticky note, and you got to cancel that, and your sticky note will pop up here, and you can move it around if you want to put it in how food security has impacted you or what candidates should know or do. You can just drop it there, and you can make it bigger or smaller by dragging the corner. So if you're not in Paul's breakout room, maybe you're in Arzina's breakout room, at the top here, there's a little arrow where you can go over to the next page, which will take you to Arzina's breakout room notes page. And the third one is Jen's breakout room. So even, not everybody has to put their notes on here, but maybe in each group, if somebody can help out, if anybody is not confident in how to put notes on here, that would be great. And that way we'll have a nice record of all of the thoughtful comments that we get in each of the rooms. So I will start up the rooms. You'll all be automatically popped into your breakout room, and then you'll automatically be brought back here in 25 minutes. Any questions on how this is going to go before we jump into those breakout rooms? All right, here we go. See you back in 25.
Work that has to happen. So some of the ideas of potentially looking at how First Nations fed themselves here, looking at some of the perennial crops that are much more easier to grow. And we also had a good discussion around proteins because, we have very few plant-based proteins that are grown commercially on Vancouver Island that could support us, and potentially looking at our seafood, our shellfish, and some of the animals that eat the abundant grass that we grow. So from a personal level, there were all many different aspects that people were looking at of how to become more food secure, from growing their own to supporting local farmers to looking at some of the systems that need to be strengthened in the local community in order to enable some more food production to happen. And then on the side for what politicians should know about, much of it also was around what municipalities can do versus regional districts. So what can happen in a municipality? How do we preserve more of the green space and enable more urban farming to happen, urban agriculture, and then at the same time take the pressure off of the rural areas? And what would it take to get more rural land into production? That's a bit of a conundrum. I don't think we answered that one, but knowing that is our rural areas are certainly at risk with the current pressures in population, which we really unfortunately don't have much control about. So lots to, I hope that summarized it well. And if I missed any points, please folks jump in.
Thank you, Arzina. And what we might do is just hear from the other two breakout groups, and then I'll maybe ask everybody to just put something in the chat that's kind of like your number one most important point after, listening to the panelists and having the discussions. So that way we kind of get a chance to put your key point for the record. So maybe, Paul, do you mind sharing with us briefly what the discussion was around in your group?
Sure. We didn't really focus on those questions in my group. People put notes in the chat, but there was questions around, people who want to farm and how do you protect what you've done. So an example of a young guy having an agreement with a farmer and then getting the land all tweaked up and ready to grow and be productive, and then being told by the farmer, well, thank you very much, it's time to go. So I was popping up resources from Foodlands Trust, community farm resources, and access agreements, and how to establish working relationships with people who do have land that could be farmed on. And there's an example, the South End of Nanaimo, Darren, I think that's who Will was referring to, Ben, who's making $75,000 a year growing on a small chunk of land. And he's able to make a serious go of it. And we discussed a number of other things like aquaculture and its connection to food security, because we do have a lot of aquaculture potential here, and we also have fish processing plants that can produce fertilizers that can be used for farming operations. And just noted that we do have one of the largest, I think the largest land-based salmon farms on Vancouver Island, right just off Jingle Pot Road. And that is a model that's going to be replicated all over. So in terms of how food security has impacted people, some people started their own garden, started doing their own canning. The heat dome damaged garden production. Discussing and managing emergency food situations, increasing requests for education on plant-based eating, directing more of their dollars to food markets and local food production. So people are actually making choices. And then people using tower gardens for aeroponics to grow food. And then a suggestion, would like to see the RDN set and track specific goals for increasing local food production. And then agricultural REITs, but probably means community land trusts, which as a way to protect farmland or to create new farmland that's community based. And that's kind of what we're working on with the clients, with the growing opportunities, is try to find a way to create a permanent community farm out there. What candidates should know or do, there's a couple of comments. Annual financial support for the Food Policy Council and continue the formation of the Food Policy Council in Nanaimo. Support Indigenous food sovereignty. We talked about that. Like, we talk a lot about agricultural land, but we're not really in the discussion so much about Indigenous food, and we're talking a lot about a colonized food system. And we're seeing developments that are wiping out, like the camas fields in the Extension Ridge area. We're seeing the destruction of forest lands that and the loss of plants like Devil's Club because they don't survive after clear cutting. Would love potential candidates, elected officials to look at feedback from the Food Share Nanaimo, led within Reimagine, centering food sovereignty, food justice, and the right to food. Support the city providing city facilities to have areas to breastfeed, breast milk aids our infants to be food secure. Increase municipal support for local farmers markets through providing specialized built market spaces, cheaper leases, and supporting advertising and public awareness of markets. Support progress on creating a Nanaimo and Food Policy Council, and look to have a lead staff to support the council. So an agricultural coordinator. And I think Arzina had mentioned that this is something that's happening up in your region. Increase municipal procurement of local food and catering at the Nanaimo Conference Center. And I would add, I didn't get a chance to put my own little sticky note in here, but as Arzina had mentioned in the chat, that they have water rates specifically for agricultural production in the Comox Valley. And they have similar water rates in Port Alberni. So here, using city water, even, you know, with systems, irrigation systems that really micromanage the use of that water, with the tiered rate, it becomes very, very expensive for farming in the city of Nanaimo if you're using city water. And I'll be talking to some counselors about that tomorrow morning. See you bright and early. That's it.
Thank you, Paul. Great. And let's maybe hear from Jen now about the discussion in her breakout group.
So we had some really interesting, we had a good discussion, and I just invite anybody else who was in the breakout room with me to jump on in, because my focus and memory isn't perfect, but together we're all 100%. So everybody's welcome to chip in as well. We had a good discussion about gray water and sort of acknowledging that that we know that with climate change that water availability is going to shift. And so one of the suggestions that came forward was around the use of gray water being made available or being available through changes in infrastructure, so that gray water could be utilized, some of it for agriculture. We also talked about the need for many agricultural crops to be need potable water in order for them to be commercially available in the community. And so but the idea around being able to conserve water and use gray water where it makes sense, and it was a strategy that was brought forward in terms of addressing some of the concerns that were discussed prior in terms of knowing that water access is going to change. And there is also the perspective that even though the population in Nanaimo has increased over time, the water usage part has gone down. And so there was a question around what the water availability might be in the future for Nanaimo, and whether or not that was actually an issue. We talked about land base, and at the moment we're, within Vancouver Island, we're not producing a lot of food locally. But Dawn had mentioned that the amount of land to fully feed one person is quite a large area. And so there's just the question there about if we're moving towards being completely food self-sufficient, then what are going to be the major steps that are going to create that change in order to help support that happening? And there was a spectrum of going from small steps all the way to what's the end goal going to be, was part of the discussion that was held within our group, and sort of looking at what are the bigger issues. One of the bigger issues is having the people who are actually willing to do the work of farming. And that was identified as a major gap, that even though we do have some land available, some of it in hay, some of it just available in general, people's backyards are like allowable for growing food as a use. And we see that there's not as much agriculture or growing food happening as there has been historically in the past. And although we didn't mention this in the group, I'd also say I think a lot more people are starting to grow now that we've had COVID and we've had climate change events. And I think, and many people are having an increase in their interest around getting involved with growing food for themselves. And so we're seeing shifts in where how many people are really engaged in growing food or in agriculture. But the gap there is people who are willing to actually go into agriculture to produce food commercially for others within the community. And organizations like Young Agrarians and organizations like Growing Opportunities are trying to fill that education gap. There's more gaps that need to be addressed in regards to that as a need, and if we're going to meet some of our goals around food sustainability. And
I hate to cut you off, but I noticed it's 8:29. Yeah, there's so much wonderful, inspiring ideas and really important considerations that we're talking about here. So I just wanted to take kind of the last minute, first of all, to invite everybody to just take, 15 seconds and pop in the chat. What's a key takeaway for you, or really the biggest thing that you want to see? So let's do that. 15 seconds. Type in your most important thing, and we'll do a bit of a chat waterfall with that. Great to see the ideas coming in. So, of course, this workshop today is a one-time event, and we do want to emphasize the importance of following this with more actions, which includes, good people who really are invested in our local food security, running for elected offices. People volunteering for some of these organizations like Growing Opportunities or Food Share, or other organizations. I'm sure there are many of them out here. Please feel free to pop in the chat if you have suggestions for where people should volunteer or get involved to make some of these changes happen. And just, I think, more generally being involved, sending emails to your elected representatives to let them know that these things are important, can go a long way. And of course, we have coming up in the Forward Nanaimo series, we've got 3 more excellent sessions over the next month. So the next one is next Thursday on housing. The following week is the donut economics, and the May 10th final session is on climate action and care for the environment. And then we're going to be having a celebration, gathering, networking event in person on Friday, May 27th at 5 o'clock. We'll send out an email with the location once that's been secured. But we hope to see you all there and continue these conversations and working together on this important issue. I do want to also just thank very much our panelists, Paul, Arzina, and Jen, for generously volunteering your time to speak at this event and sharing your knowledge with all of us. So thank you very much. And I hope that we'll see many of you at the upcoming sessions. And we'll do our best to capture everything that was said tonight through the chat and through the Jamboards and through the session recording, and move forward towards the elections. So thank you, everybody, very much, and have a great night.